Welcome to the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting Snow at Furnace Run. The photograph on the right was the inspiration for this painting. It's a covered bridge that goes over the creek called Furnace Run in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. It's a subject that I've painted a number of times. I begin by drawing a light pencil sketch using a B pencil on my 140-pound cold press Watercolor watercolor paper. I'm working on a quarter sheet, so it's 11 inches by 15 inches. Before I begin applying paint, there's several areas that I'm going to mask using different techniques. The first area I'm going to mask by using clear packing tape, similar to how you would use frisket paper. So I gently apply the clear packing tape to the surface of the paper, and then I take a sharp knife and gently cut out the shape that I want to protect. Once I've cut the shape out, I'll remove the rest of the packing tape, and all that will remain will be the shape that I want to protect, the area that I want to protect. It's best, if you're going to try this technique, to try the paper that you're using and the tape that you have, just to make sure that you don't have any issues. I rarely have any problem. Occasionally when I remove it, it will lift just a little bit of the nap of the paper, but not too much, and I really don't have any issues with it. I normally use the tip of the knife blade to lift up the edge of the tape, and then I just pull it away from the work surface, leaving the area that I want protected, covered with the tape. If you're going to give this technique a try, it does take some patience. I would recommend practicing first on some scrap paper with the type of paper that you use and the tape that you have, just to make sure that it works, and then you get a better idea on how to cut the tape and lift it without damaging the paper. I've used this technique before on complex full sheet paintings where I've spent over 2 hours just in the masking process before I begin to paint. I'm using the packing tape to mask the edge of the snow along the top of the road area there, and I'm going to do that on the right side of this also, so that I can put some large washes on the top half of this painting without getting any of that paint into the area that's going to be the edge of the snow. So here I've applied some of the tape, and I'm cutting the edge that is the snowbank in front of this covered bridge, and I can apply the wash above that and protect the area of the snowbank where I'm going to have it a lighter tone, and have some of the highlighted areas of the composition will be on the edge of these snowbanks. And I'm going to do the same on the top right. There's an area back there where the snow is laying on the roll of the land, and I'm going to put a wash above that, and I'm going to protect that area of snow by using this tape. Next, I'm going to use a different masking technique. I'm going to use a liquid mask, and this is a plastic bottle that I filled myself from a large bottle of masking fluid, and it's a type of a squeeze bottle that's used for quilling, for that craft quilling where they put glue in it. And it's an inexpensive bottle, and it's easy to fill, and I find it's a more economical solution than buying the pre-filled masking fluid pens. I have these bottles and the masking fluid that I use all listed on the studio page of my website, surowicz.com. So if you want to see specifically what I'm using, you can go there and you can see it. And this has a nice needle tip on it, a fine tip, and it will clog occasionally, but I've had pretty good luck with it. And so what I'm doing right now is I'm just trying to give the suggestion of where snow is going to be lying on the branches and where it catches on the tree trunk. And the woods in the back are so dense that really I'm going to paint this almost as a solid tone, and some of these marks I'm making right now will be the cracks of light that would appear between the trees. So after this is dried, I'm going to come in with a large wash, and that will provide the majority of the tone for those distant trees, although I will come back in and I'll make some darker marks also to indicate tree trunks. But you can see that these are very vertical marks, and I'm going to use these to give the indication of trees in the distance here. This does take a bit, so I'm not going to show every mark that I make with this masking fluid bottle that I have, but I'll just give some samples here of some of the marks that I'm making. Here again, still some vertical marks to indicate some of the trees. I'm applying some masking fluid here on some of these trees that are more in the foreground, and this will give the suggestion again of snow laying on the various elements of the tree. Here I'm making some marks to give indication of some of the grassy shapes, the linear marks of saplings and shrubs that are coming out of the snow around the base of these trees. And they go at all angles. Some of them are curved, some of them are straight, and some are short, some are long. So it just gives a nice variety, and this is an easy way for me to provide this texture and these patterns that give the suggestion of brush and briar bushes and branches that are just going every which way. Now the last bit of masking I'm going to do at this point is to take a toothbrush, and I've put some soapy water on the toothbrush to help with the cleanup after I'm done using it, but I'm dipping the toothbrush into a jar of masking fluid. You can also squeeze some on from a bottle, and then I just splatter the masking fluid by flicking the bristles or tapping it against my hand gently, and it gives this random pattern of splatters and spray that I like in winter scenes. It's a nice way to create a texture that gives a suggestion of snow flying through the air. And when I'm done, I just rinse it in water. I've let my masking fluid air dry thoroughly. You don't want to use a hair dryer to dry the masking fluid, but once it's dry and it's set, you can use a hair dryer as you paint without any problem. It's not going to cause a problem, but that initial drying you want to let it dry by just air drying. So I'm going to begin here with a wash of some gamboge. So it's got quite a bit of water in it, so it's a light wash, but I want to have a little bit of a glow underneath a blue that I'm going to put over top of this. So I'm starting with gamboge, and then I'm going to come in wet and wet with some cerulean blue. And it's a little bit of a gray there, but I'm going to come back with some more pigment, and I'm going to take this wash down to the point where I've masked using the clear packing tape. So it will be the edge of the snowbanks that are laying on the ground. So because I have that packing tape there, I'm going to get a nice clean edge, and the same along the top of the bridge, the covered bridge on the roof. That's going to give me a nice clean edge there because I've masked that off using the clear packing tape. And I'm going to take that wash all the way to the edge. And it doesn't bother me at all that I'm painting over top of what's eventually going to be tree shapes, tree trunks, because those tree shapes are going to actually be a darker value than what I'm painting here in this sky wash. So I'm not concerned about painting around them because I'm just going to paint over top of this wash that I've applied. Now I'm going to come in with some raw sienna, so a nice warm tone, and I'm using these washes. I'm working wet and wet, and I'm using them to give the suggestion of these masses of tree branches and trunks and twigs. Once the leaves fall off, you have thousands and thousands of branches and twigs that are exposed, and they make kind of a hazy shape in themselves, even though they don't have any leaves on the branches. So my process here is I'm working wet on wet into the sky wash, and now I'm just giving a suggestion of these masses of trees, and then I'm going to come over top of them with more linear brushwork to give a suggestion of branches and tree trunks. And keep in mind, this is going to dry lighter than when it is first applied. After I dry with a hairdryer, this is going to lighten up some. So I'm doing all this brushwork here with a 1-inch flat brush, a wash brush. You don't want to do this type of work with just a tiny little brush, making a bunch of little brush strokes. Just take a nice big bold brush strokes. And I'm using a combination of a warm and cool mixtures here. You can see that I have that kind of a warm sienna, raw sienna, burnt sienna tone right to the right of my hand there between that and the bridge. And now I'm coming in with some cooler tones to the left and then a little bit in the background, just to give a suggestion of this one area of tree getting this warm tone hitting it. And I'm using burnt sienna, raw sienna, and some ultramarine blue and a little bit of cobalt blue. And occasionally I might touch in some royal blue if I want a real dark. But most of this brushwork here is being done with this 1-inch brush with mixtures of raw sienna, burnt sienna, and ultramarine blue. And you see I'm working wet and wet, so I'm getting nice soft edges. And again, I'll repeat, I'm not concerned about painting over top of the tree shapes, because the tree shapes that I'm going to paint will be a darker value and I won't have any problem seeing those. And then there's also some areas where I had masked with a masking fluid that once lifted will show some light values. I'm going to take some of that tone there right into the structure of the bridge. And you can see where some of that white is coming through this wash. Those are the areas that I've taped off, or some of them to a lesser extent are where I've used the liquid mask. It doesn't stand out as much, but the areas where I've taped with packing tape stay pure white because there's no pigment adhering to them at all. I've completely dried this with a hairdryer, and you can see how it's lightened up some. But I still have pretty strong middle values in the areas that I've painted. And now I'm going to take my knife and use the tip of the knife to lift up the edge of this tape, and I'm going to remove that. And you can see that it's left a nice clean edge on those areas where I want to be the edge of the snowbanks. Keep in mind, the first masking I applied was the clear tape, and then I came over with liquid mask, but those areas where the tape was doesn't have the same masking fluid, liquid masking, that I applied to the rest of the composition because the packing tape was there. Now that I remove it, I'm going to come back in with some of this masking fluid to continue the textures and patterns that I have above this area that was protected. So they have some harmony between the two. I don't want one to have this kind of textural quality and the other area not, because it was initially masked with packing tape. So I'm going to come back in and make the suggestion of these branches and saplings coming out of the ground, just as I did in the area above that. And I'm also going to come in with some splatter with the toothbrush so that it's consistent across the whole composition. I'm also going to apply some masking fluid to some of these other areas that were covered by the tape and prevented me from masking them initially. So I'm taking a different squeeze bottle. This has a wider nozzle on it. It doesn't have the wire tip. It's got a plastic tip, and puts a larger bead of masking fluid down. And this is another bottle that I filled myself. And so I'm masking off some of the areas that are where the snow is lying on top of the rocks, and also to pick up some of the contour on the land. So I'm just doing a little bit more masking in the areas that I couldn't get to because of the packing tape that I had done. Now, as I had mentioned, I'm going to come in with the toothbrush and put some splatter in this area that wasn't accessible before, so that it's consistent with the rest of the composition. Once again, I've let all the masking fluid air dry, and now I'm going to come in with a wash to give the suggestion of the shadowed areas in the snow, and I'm using a cobalt blue to do this. And this foreground area of snow is going to be fairly dark middle value, so that I can differentiate it more as the foreground as compared to that middle ground where the road is, where it's going to be highlighted with the brighter snowbanks. And you can see some of the brushwork that I'm doing is grayed down. I've added a little bit of burnt sienna to some of this mixture to give it some neutral tones also. And as I work further in my composition, I'll probably come back with another tone over top of some of this area. Here I'm going to take a darker mixture of with some burnt sienna, some alizarin crimson, and a little bit of ultramarine blue to give me a dark red tone that I'm going to use on the side of this bridge, more the shadowed side of this bridge. I'm going to thin that out a little bit and gradate it down the side. And some of the mixtures that I'm applying here have a little bit more blue in them, or leaning more towards a cool side than some of the other marks that I make, which have a little bit more of a reddish tone to it. Here I continue to take this wash across that structure, and I'm going to get some of this area here around the front of this bridge. And you can see how I've put some of this brown tone. I have all these branches going over it. I like to take these obstructed views, some partially obstructed views of subjects where you don't have necessarily a clear shot at what you're looking at without looking through some branches and sticks and twigs. I like to do that along the edge of riverbanks. Kind of get down to a viewpoint where you have to look through some of the brush and some of the saplings to look across the pond or a lake. I just think it's a more interesting view. Now I'm going to take a dark value using the ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, touch of royal blue to give me a dark value. And I'm just doing some brush work to give the indication of rocks. And I've inset the photograph, the reference photo, in the lower left-hand corner. And you can see I'm just making some marks to give the suggestion of those rocks covering that bank. I'm not trying to render each and every little rock. I'm just giving the suggestion, my interpretation of what I see there, those rocks with the snow laying on them. I don't have to paint every rock, and I just make marks to give the indication. I'm going to continue with my darker value here to give the indication of rocks on the other bank. Just the same type of brushwork that I did on the right side, I'm doing on the opposite bank. Just suggesting that there's some rocks laying under the snow. Next, I'm going to remove the packing tape from the covered bridge structure. I didn't remove that earlier, so I'm going to lift that off using the same approach, taking the point of my knife underneath the tape and then lifting it off. There you go. And you can see that it leaves a nice clean edge on where I unmasked. Now I'm going to take a dark value, and this is a mixture with some raw umber and some ultramarine blue and a little bit of raw sienna mixed in at times, and I'm using a rigger brush, and now I'm given the indication of trees. So I'm going to make some brush marks, some linear marks that give the suggestion of trunks and some that give the suggestion of branches. And then I'll use a finer rigger brush to give you a suggestion of some of the smaller branches and twigs. And you can see that some of these aren't going to go all the way to the ground. They're going to be broken up because there's trees in front and behind some of these. But again, you can see now why I wasn't concerned about painting over top of these with the earlier washes. Because this is a much darker value that I'm using, I have no problem painting over the top of the wet and wet brushwork that I did earlier. Here I'm painting this tree that comes down, that's a little closer to us, and it comes over the line there that's the edge of the snowbank of the road because it's more on the bank. And you can see the bottom of the tree, how it's angled to help give that suggestion that it's on a slope there. Here I'm making more and more of these marks. This is a very dense wooded area, and I'm using these dark linear marks to represent the close proximity of all these trees, and they stop there at the edge of the snow. So it's not my objective here to render individual branches that I see in the photograph. I just make marks that present textures or patterns that represent the image that I see or my subject. It's my interpretation of what I see there. There's a sapling here that's closer to the bank of the creek here, and there's another one that has a lot of curve to it, so that curve helps bring you back into the composition. Now I'm going to go to the other side of this bridge. I'm going to make some similar brush marks to give the suggestion of these trees that are again back in this wooded area. Now I'm going to start painting some of these trees and saplings that are in front of this bridge structure, and having the overlap in your composition makes it more believable. Proper positioning of values, contrasting of hard edges against soft edges, warm colors and cool colors. These are all elements that make the depth or the feeling of depth in your painting more believable. The trees that I'm painting right now are on the front side of this covered bridge, but there's also trees in the background, and I'm going to paint one here that's just on the other side of this bridge and back a little bit, and it's going to come down to the roof line and stop. And again, the combination of those trees in front with this behind start to build layers and start to build depth into the composition, because you know that tree is back a ways because it's being overlapped by the covered bridge, which is in turn being overlapped by the saplings, which in turn is being overlapped by some of the brush, the saplings and twigs that are coming out of the ground and are a lighter tone. Now I've switched to a smaller rigger brush, and I've loaded it with a dark value, and now I'm just going to make some linear marks that represent the saplings and the twigs and the sticks that are sticking out of the ground and kind of the sticker bush that's at the base of these trees. And it's just very random that I'm applying them, but it's the texture and the pattern that I'm after. And in some of these, I try to use the direction to help guide the eye and make an area interesting just by the shapes and the relationships that are formed by the different angles. Now I'm doing some more work here on the area that I had masked with the clear packing tape earlier in my painting process. And I'm just making some marks here to give the indication of the boards that are here in the top part of the covered bridge. It's painted white and it has a lot of shadows in this area. So I'm just making some marks here that represent that structure there on the top of the bridge. Here I'm going to carry that dark valued marks down a little farther, so it's in an area where it's partially covered by some of the trees and in the shadow, and then making some marks here on the other side of this covered bridge. Here I'm taking a brush that has some paint in it, but it's very low moisture content. It's barely damp with some pigment, and I'm just kind of scrubbing the surface a little bit, and it's just leaving a little bit of texture here to give the suggestion of all the branches and the twigs and some of the mass, that kind of that's the very hazy shape that's formed as a result of just literally thousands of sticks and twigs. I'm going to use a little different brush here. I'm going to use a 1/2 inch flat brush. And again, this is loaded, but it's really almost dry. It's very low moisture content. And I'm just dragging it along the surface to help suggest kind of the haziness that you get when you have all these twigs and sticks and brush that are associated with this time of season. I want this foreground area, this snowy area, to be more of a dark middle value. So I'm taking a mixture of cobalt blue with some raw sienna and a little bit of royal blue in it to put a darker wash over this area. And there'll be parts of the white that are still going to show through and parts of this cobalt blue that are going to show through. I'm going to take that darker tone onto the other side of the creek here on the other bank, and not as extensive, but still show some of that dark middle value over there. And I'm going to touch some of the rocks. Now I'm going to start to paint the creek area, the water area. And even though this is winter, there's still open water. So there's snow on the banks and there's ice in the water, snow covering the rocks in the water, but there's still open water, and that open water is going to pick up some reflective light. In this case, I'm picking that warm tone up from the woods and putting it into the water. And then I'm going to take a dark value here and the same color that I'm using for these trees and pick that up, working wet on wet to suggest the reflection of some of the trees. And now I'm going to take some cerulean blue that I started to use in the sky and pick up just a little bit of sky tone in this area. And then I'm going to, just as I did with that warm tone, I'm going to make a dark mark to suggest a continuation of that reflection. Here I'm going to continue painting this reflective light with the reflections of the tree shapes. So I have some more of this, it's raw sienna, and it's picking up that warm tone. that's in the wooded area in the back and carrying it into this part of the composition. And just as I did in the other areas, I'll take a darker tone and continue the reflections of the trees into this area. I don't want to overdo it, just a few marks, working wet and wet. And it's enough just to give that suggestion of the woods carrying down into this. So I've picked up the warm tone from the wooded area, and I've picked up the dark values of the trunks and branches. I'm taking the warm tone a little further to the right there. In that area also, we'll pick up some of the reflection of trees. I've completely dried the paper, and now I'm going to remove the masking fluid that was applied earlier. So I'm using a rubber cement pickup eraser, and I just rub it on the surface to remove the masking fluid. And keep in mind, throughout this whole process of painting, I've been using a hair dryer to dry, but it doesn't create any problems with the masking fluid. As long as I let the initial application of the masking fluid air dry, I'm fine to use a hair dryer throughout my painting process. And when I remove this and I rub it, and when I'm near the edge, I try and come from off the paper onto the paper rather than going off the paper into the tape, because it'll tend to lift the tape up, and the paper will start to won't be as secure to the board. So when I'm near an edge, I try to come over the tape into the paper to remove the masking fluid, as opposed to dragging the eraser into the edge of the tape and lifting it off. Now I've removed the masking fluid, and there's some areas that I want to tone down a little bit. Here I'm taking a warm wash of raw sienna and putting over top of some of those areas that have been exposed now that the masking fluid is removed, and toning those down to make them feel a little bit more distant. I'm doing the same on the right side here, but I'm using a cooler tone instead of the warm tone that I used on the other side there. So just toning some of the whiteness of that area down, you can still see that it's a much lighter value. You can still see the marks underneath the wash, but it tones it down, because what you don't want is all those masked areas just being the white of the paper. You want to protect them to save the white, but some of those you want to put a light glaze of color on. Here I'm taking some cobalt blue, and I'm highlighting the edges of some of these areas that have where the paper is protected, to give another feeling of some reflected light, a cool reflective light in shadowed areas on the snow. So just some touches here and there. I'm going to take a little bit of this tone and go across the way, and I'm going to take this cobalt blue up some of these trees to carry that color up the top a little bit. Here I'm putting a little on the edge of the covered bridge, and again hitting some of these areas of the trees to give that kind of cool reflective light and shadow. I want this side of the bridge structure to be a darker value. And I probably should have gone a little darker earlier when I still had the masking fluid on, but I can still paint around enough to save these marks that I protected when I masked. But I want that to be a darker value in some of those areas. A few of those trees are feeling a little spotty, and I don't have enough structure for me, so I'm gonna take a darker value and go over the top of some of those areas to make it feel a little bit more pronounced, make more of a statement than it does once I've removed the masking fluid there. I want that to be a little bit darker underneath the bridge there, so I'm going to do some brush work there. This is the combination of royal blue, burnt sienna, and a little bit of raw umber. Earlier I was talking about building layers and overlap. These areas that I had used the masking fluid pen overlap these dark areas and shapes, the trees, the bridge itself. Once I remove it, those white shapes overlap. But in turn, I want to come back over top of those with some overlapping shapes so they're not completely exposed, because they're not just going to be on the top of everything. They're going to have some other shapes going over them. So once I've removed the mask, I normally come back at some point here, as I am here, and take a dark value and go over the top of those light areas that remove. So in essence, what I have is darker tones that are overlapped by the light tones that I've masked, and then I come back with another dark tone over top of those light tones. So I have multiple layers of value that help build depth into my painting. I want to have a little bit more definition on the edge of the covered bridge there, so I'm going to put a dark value right there on that edge. I'm going to put a white mat on this to get a good look at it, and that's my painting, Snow at Furnace Run. I used a variety of masking techniques to help suggest the texture and help create overlap throughout the painting process. I hope you enjoyed watching this. Be sure to check out Rick Surowicz Watercolor Friends and Subscribers on Facebook. And if you have questions about my material, you can always go to the studio page on my website. If you have specific questions, you can email me at contactrsurowiczart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.